Okay. So, can you hear me? Can you hear me well? All right, very good.
Yes, yes.
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation for me to speak today. It's a great honor. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to give a brief introduction about the Japanese racing. And I wanted to prepare some material for that, but I couldn't do that. So let me give you quickly. In terms of breeding, we have 7,000 thoroughbred breeding each year in Japan. Yeah, now you can hear me well, I think. And yearly turnover money for JRA, Japan Racing Association Racing, we have about 20 billion US dollars per year. So it's big money, I think. And Japan Racing Association have 10 race courses all over Japan. And 8 of them have both jump and flat races. And 2 has only flat races. And surfaces, we have both turf and dirt. And let me give you one example about the total prize money. Japan Cup, definitely the biggest race of the year, which held every November, late November in Japan, Tokyo race course. Total prize money of Japan Cup is 6 million US dollars. So it's a big money again. So today I'd like to talk to you about this topic, which is definitely an important topic for discussion internationally. This way.
Oh, sorry. One moment. Okay.
Not yet?
Okay.
You can proceed, please.
Not possible. I don't know. One moment. Oh, one moment. One moment.
Yeah. Take your time.
Oh.
All right.
Okay. Try again.
All right.
Yes.
Okay, it's not working.
I see.
And I would also like to give a brief introduction about myself. I was born and raised in Japan, and I graduated from Hokkaido University. It's a northern island of Japan in 2008, and joined the Japan Racing Association in the same year. And being employed as an official veterinarian, I gained experience in general practice and regulatory work. Also, I did some research and published papers with regard to MRI, anesthesia, injury statistics on race days, and so on. At present, I serve as a deputy manager of anti-doping section, and in Japan, I am responsible for international races from veterinary perspective. Internationally, I serve as a number of IFHA committees, including Technical Advisory Committee, Horse Welfare Committee, and Advisory Council on Equine Prohibited Substance and Practices. And in addition, I belong to the Executive Committee of IGSRV as a regional representative Asia, overseeing matters related to medication and welfare in the region. So let's move on to the topic. These are the headlines of the recent news related to gene doping. As you can see, the technologies to develop genetically modified animals has become a reality. So we, as a racing regulator and an organizer, should be ahead of these advances. From this background, the objective of my talk is to cover the regulation and the detection method of gene doping. Here are the contents of my talk. First, I'd like to refer to the background of doping control in horse racing, and then talk about the history of drug development and its implications on the industry. After that, I'm going to dig deep into gene doping by comparing two distinctive methods, which are gene transfer and gene editing. Also, I'd like to point out some practical strategies to tackle this issue. Finally, I would like to share our experience of elevating anti-doping standard in Japan. So the following slide will show why anti-doping is required in horse racing. First of all, from the aspect of betting, doping control is indispensable to ensure that legitimate dividend is refunded to the public. The use of drug that can increase or decrease performance can affect a race result. Secondly, horse racing as a sport does not allow a horse to receive prize and honors based on results won through unfairly obtained ability. And in addition, there's no doubt that drug abuse is detrimental to the reputation of horse racing and can lead to loss of fans. Next, from the perspective of breeding, we need to breed strong horses to pass such abilities to their offspring. And if this is prevented by the use of drugs, it can result in the selection of weak horses. Finally, from welfare perspective, which has been the focus of much attention in the recent years, if they suffer accident or illnesses by the use of drugs, it is against the horse welfare. Besides, if a horse running under the influence of drugs caused a serious accident, the safety of not only the horse, but also the jockeys would be greatly affected. All of these symbolize anti-doping is very important in horse racing. History shows doping emerged through the illicit use of therapy. For a long time, natural ingredients were used as a drug. And in 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered that mold called penicillium was active against bacteria. Following such discovery, the production of drug commenced using microorganisms. Since then, drugs targeting receptors, drugs made by recombination, drugs focusing on enzymes and antibody type of drug were developed. And such advancement in biotechnology, including gene therapy, poses potential hazards with regard to the misuse and abuse of such advancement. In fact, gene doping is now widely recognized as a threat to horse racing. Let me give you one example. Tendon injury is definitely troublesome, a pain in the neck for us, and I think many of you here would agree with me. From veterinary perspective, a part of the reason why tendon is slow to heal is due to its low blood supply into the tissue. To overcome this issue, studies found that use of growth factor induces blood supplies. On the other hand, studies also found that the effect does not seem to last long enough. In the recent years, administration of the genes producing growth factors was conducted in horses. Such gene therapy is expected to achieve treatment effect for a longer period of time. On the other hand, if these techniques are abused, it can be a problem because growth factors can have an anabolic effect if you inject systemically. The technique to administer DNA is called gene transfer or transgene. Gene transfer is defined as a gene that is artificially introduced into another organism. It may be easier to understand that these are misuse or abuse of gene therapy. Such misuse or abuse involves administration of genes to alter natural gene expression for performance enhancement, which falls into doping. How can we attempt gene transfer? I'm just going to explain in a nutshell. Usually, a carrier called vectors, such as viruses and plasmids, are used to deliver transgene into a cell. Then, the gene sequence is transcribed into RNA, then translated into a string of amino acids, which are modified to create the protein. As in the slide, the creation of RNA from DNA is called transcription, and the creation of a protein from an RNA is called translation. And it is the protein the cells eventually produce following gene transfer. And depending on the function of the protein, it can lead to performance enhancement. Next, I'm going to talk about gene editing, which is slightly different from gene transfer and definitely more troublesome. Gene editing is defined as any process or treatment which involves the insertion, deletion, or replacement of DNA. In the recent years, development of genetic engineering technology, such as CRISPR-Cas9, has made it possible to introduce short insertion or deletions to targeted regions. The use of gene editing can lead to production of genetically modified animals, which is a threat to horse racing and also breeding industry. Such risk of creating genetically modified animals could infringe the definition of thoroughbred. This is because, according to the Article 12 of the IFHA International Agreement, a horse will no longer be eligible as a thoroughbred once the heritable genome has been modified. The heritable genome refers to the genes that is passed down to the offspring. Such horses must be removed from the stud book. Now that you've got some picture of what gene doping is, gene doping is a general term covering a broad range of conduct that is not permitted in racing or breeding at any time. This includes, but is not limited to, the use of gene transfer and gene editing, as we have just covered. Gene transfer is the abuse or misuse of gene therapy in which genes are introduced to alter natural gene expression. Gene editing is a more precise technique to alter an existing DNA sequence. And because gene editing of an embryo can modify the heritable genome, it can infringe the definition of thoroughbred and status of such horse's progeny. So, how can we combat the menace of gene doping? I'm going to highlight 3 practical strategies, which are implementation of regulation, introduction of testing, and investment on resources. First and foremost, to help combat the threats presented by gene doping, the IFHA has developed a model framework for its prohibition and control. The Article 6A of the International Agreement prohibits the presence of any agents that are capable of causing an action or effect on gene expression, which includes but is not limited to gene editing agent. In addition, the Article 6b of the International Agreement prohibits gene editing and gene therapy at all time. In the meantime, gene therapy can be conducted exceptionally under certain conditions. That is, with prior approval of a racing authority, limited to those which is not capable of modifying a heritable genome and is not a threat to welfare and the integrity of racing. At present, there are no such product of gene therapies that are licensed for use in horses. But in the future, there may come a time where gene therapy may be allowed if the safety and the efficacy is properly assessed. For avoidance of doubt, the Article 6b of the International Agreement defines PRP and autologous conditioned serum are not gene therapy. As such, such therapy should not be banned. Then how about the use of stem cells? Simple answer to this would be yes, stem cells are allowed, but it depends on the method. Studies show that conventional use of stem cells was effective for injuries such as tendonitis. So this should be allowed for the benefit of horses. In contrast, what if the genetic manipulation is conducted on stem cells before the transplant? In such case, cells containing new genetic information are to be transplanted back into the horse, which falls into gene doping. In Japan, gene transfer is defined as administration of genes and related substances. Since this is a prohibited practice, trainers must ensure that gene transfer is not conducted regardless of whether inside or outside of a JRA facility. The JRA's rules of racing defines gene editing to refuse registration of horses that have undergone gene editing. I think implementation of such regulation would be quite essential for deterrence. Next, together with the implementation of regulation, introduction of testing is another key strategy for deterrence. At present, there are two testing methods available in the field. The first one is PCR, and I'm not going to go into any detail because I think you already know the basics of PCR due to COVID pandemic. PCR can detect gene transfer or transgenes by targeting the DNA introduced into the body. Here the key is for the PCR to distinguish transgenes from the natural DNA. And this is possible because the inserted gene is different to the normal DNA. As you can see it on the slide, genes are usually composed of exons and introns. Exons are important because exons are the regions of coding DNA that are translated into protein. In contrast, introns are not important because introns are non-coding regions. And in conducting gene transfer, exons are only used, and PCR targets these unique sequences. The second method for gene doping test is genome sequencing using NGS, which is a next generation sequencer. In contrast to the PCR-based method, NGS uses a different technology to sequence all the DNA in a sample. NGS can detect gene editing as well as transgenes. While NGS-based method is a powerful procedure, it has some drawbacks when compared to PCR-based method. The analysis costs are high and the procedures are complex and requires rigorous information security. Now I'm going to quickly explain how the test is conducted in Japan. In Japan, over 5,000 racehorses are sampled annually for the test to detect transgenes. Blood sample is collected in conjunction with our out-of-competition testing program. First, the screening analysis is conducted to test a number of targeted genes, including myostatin, growth hormone, metabolic modulators, and so on. And then we proceed with confirmation analysis by targeting single suspected genes. And globally, there's a growing interest in the development of the test for gene doping. To the best of my knowledge, Japan and Hong Kong are the two countries, regions, performing gene doping tests to the racehorses. In Japan, the test targeting gene editing as well as transgenes has started since 2023. That means this year. In Australia and the US, the test is under development and gene doping is monitored on a research basis. In countries such as Great Britain, France, and the Middle East, basic research is ongoing. The third important point to best overcome the threat would be investment on resources. Active investment on the labs is essential to establish a comprehensive testing capability. Education of the staff, including veterinarians and chemists, is equally important, and in this regard, I suggest international conference such as ICRAV, which takes place every 2 years, would be one of the best options to have your staff take part. This year, the ICRAV is going to be held in Hong Kong, and over 200 to 300 participants are expected, and I will attend that too. Here I'm going to explain our approach, Japan's approach, as an example to elevate anti-doping standard. In Japan, with the use of specially promoted fund, the JRA has implemented the 6-year project to develop testing methods for gene doping. Through the first 3-year project, the lab received about $2.5 million for measures against gene doping and genetic integrity. Subsequently, about $2 million were invested on the lab to establish testing method for gene doping in racehorses. In addition, to establish a new drug testing system at the lab, the JRA implemented another 8-year project. In total, about $56 million were invested on the lab to upgrade, which led to the appointment as a reference laboratory by the IFHA and also the FEI in 2022 and 2021, respectively. With the lab obtaining testing capability with international standard, samples for Tokyo Olympic equestrian events were also analyzed in the lab in Japan, which means a lot to us. This is a press release from the IFHA announcing that the Japanese lab was appointed as the 6th IFHA reference lab. Other reference labs are in Australia, France, Great Britain, Hong Kong, and the US. Thanks to the advancement in testing capability, the number of drugs that can be detectable increased dramatically, which makes it possible to implement advanced drug controlling policy in Japan. On top of that, this year, BHA, the British Horse Racing Authority, relaxed requirement for Japanese runners traveling to compete in Great Britain. This decision signifies the BHA's confidence in Japan's robust anti-doping standard and carries substantial significance for Japan. All of these represent the importance of investment on resources. In summary, doping control is very important in horse racing. It is important from the aspect of integrity, fairness, horse welfare, and protection of breeding. Doping disrupts the level playing field and undermines the integrity of the sport, which can damage the confidence of the public and fans. It also poses a threat to the safety and welfare of equine and human athletes. In addition, doping has the potential to mask genetic disorders and could impact the selection of breeding. So we should acknowledge that the gene doping is not a rumor. Gene doping presents integrity and welfare threat to the industry, and the abuse of gene editing can infringe the definition of thoroughbred, which can lead to the collapse of racing industry. As such, we must tackle this issue. Still, no evidence exists that gene doping has been used, but techniques already exist for applying many forms of gene doping. So, implementation of anti-doping strategies, such as introduction of gene doping tests, will be quite essential. Thank you very much again. Any questions?
Proszę Państwa, pytania? Proszę.
Ja mam takie pytanie, bo w momencie, kiedy już pojawia się coś takiego... W momencie, kiedy już pojawia się coś takiego jako jedna z możliwości, jak doping genetyczny, mimo nawet bardzo zaawansowanych systemów kontroli, istnieje jednak możliwość, że ten doping nie zostanie wykryty w odpowiednim momencie i taki osobnik trafi do hodowli i przekaże ten zmodyfikowany gen dalej i dalej. Czy kolejnym krokiem, żeby w jakiś sposób to wyeliminować, będzie konieczność poddawania testom genetycznym wszystkich koni przed startem, przed treningiem? Czy to zmierza ku temu?
Yes, I think today I introduced two techniques. One is gene transfer and the other is gene editing. And it's fair to say gene editing is more nasty because, as you pointed out, it can pass down to the offspring. So to protect breeding, you must have some deterrence, and having testing method is one possible deterrence.
Okay, thank you.
Nawiążę trochę do pytania tutaj pani. Czy EFHA i ewentualnie Studbook Committee nie powinny jednak przewidzieć możliwości, aby konie, u których na przykład stwierdzono jakiekolwiek praktyki zabronione dotyczące naruszania genów, nie powinny być na stałe właśnie wykluczone z jakiejkolwiek formy hodowli, bo rozumiem, że taki koń nie będzie mógł być dopuszczony do wyścigów, wszystko pięknie. Natomiast hodowla zostanie, powiedzmy, wykreślony z ksiąg stadnych pełnej krwi angielskiej, natomiast równie dobrze może trafić na przykład do hodowli koni innych ras. Czy na przykład nie powinno być przewidziane, nie wiem, jakakolwiek forma kastracji chemicznej, żeby temu zapobiec, bo przypomnę, jednym z zapisów EFHA jest również to, że konie o niejednoznacznej płci mają zakaz startów. I wszystko jest pięknie, ładnie. Natomiast przypominam sprawę klaczy Wałacha Flamingo Girl, szybciutko już, Flamingo Girl, który w 2021 roku skończył karierę w Niemczech jako klacz, natomiast nagle w 2023 roku po operacji zaczął biegać jako Wałach, czyli przepisy można obejść. Stąd moje pytanie, czy można coś przewidzieć szybciej?
So I think removal from the stat book is something you should do, because if you allow horses that have once undergone gene editing, you never know how long the effect lasts. Even if you prevent a horse from breeding, still on racing, the effect might last forever. So you have to remove the horse itself from both racing and breeding. That's my answer. Hope I'm answering your question.
Proszę, nie. Proszę Państwa, będzie możliwość zadawania pytań po 17, także na razie teraz ja.